When talking about media and its ability to tell stories, games are an interesting case. For example, we use the word story interchangeably with almost all other narrative forms. We leave a movie and say, "What a great story." We hand a book to a friend and say, "This is a beautiful story." It's understood that their narrative is so essential to their purpose that the word story can serve as a synonym for the entire experience. Games we don't treat this way. We would never say a game is a story. Games always have stories in them, or, especially in the case of sports or board games, make for good stories. This semantic distinction is enough to suggest that games aren't storytelling forms at all, or at least not inherently. And this seems to be the pervasive point of view. For many, a game might have a wonderful story in the same way that a bus might have a painting pasted to its side. Game criticism and game reviews often reinforce this segregation by considering a game's story separately from its gameplay. But what if these more mechanical components of a game's experience were actually where games told their best stories? When you sit down to a game of Monopoly, what would you say is the plot or narrative of the game? Given the pieces and places of a conventional Monopoly set, Monopoly tells a story of competing real estate moguls. This constitutes what most people would call its theme, an aesthetic or narrative overlay mapped onto the rules of a board game. But a theme doesn't tell all of a game's story. The story of a given game, the true feeling of playing it, isn't readily apparent by looking at what comes in the box. With a set of National Parks Monopoly like I've got here, even what comes in the box may present conflicting notions of the game's story. National parks are, by definition, some of the only remaining spaces that can't be bought and sold. As such, National Parks Monopoly's dog-eat-dog capitalist plots are hidden under a veneer of peaceful, shared landscapes. What we see doesn't tell us what we get.
For the center fielder, Ken Landreau, this should do it. The Dodgers are the 1981 champions of baseball.
Likewise, the story of a given baseball game can't be divined from the equipment or field. The intrigue of poker can't be inferred from a deck of cards. The trailer for a new Zelda game may show the princess implicated in yet another predicament, but saving her will create other plots entirely. This plagues marketers advertising a game. Game trailers may show gameplay but struggle to communicate the story's experience beyond cutscenes and graphics. Designing a Kickstarter page for a new board game presents the same challenge. Novels actually struggle in this way too. Turns out story, regardless of medium, is hard to advertise. Before reading a book, you see a title, a blurb, an image on the dust jacket, maybe read an excerpt. None of these capture the feeling of the novel. After reading, the experience of a 300-page novel is too complex and invisible to know at once how the book captured you. For games, like other storytelling media, much of what makes a given piece valuable is also what's buried, only accessible with time invested. Since it's these invisible plots in games that this essay is after, I'll be using a tool to visualize the otherwise hidden forces of plot in literature, Freytag's pyramid. As the line goes up, it might be seen as measuring two things that often go hand in hand. First, tension. The conflict intensifies as long as the climax is delayed. This is usually the lesson taught with the model in 9th grade English. Second, it measures the mounting interest of the reader to see the plot concluded. In the case of Monopoly and thousands of other games, this tension is driven by competition and the question of who will win. Unfortunately for Monopoly, this tension is often settled long before the end of the game, when one player starts to emerge as a clear winner. And when this tension is lost, so is much of the game's interest. Freytag's model communicates some universal truths about stories that are just as true for games. The model suggests tension and interest are profoundly correlated. Since a reader's rising interest is predicated on conflict, Freytag suggests, maybe counterintuitively, that interest is fueled by challenge, delay, antagonism, that we're most attracted to a text when it actually resists being comprehended all at once. Mazes are strange. Typically, when I walk from point A to point B, my path takes the least amount of effort required. Mazes confound this path as much as possible with the space they're given. So what's the attraction? An answer might come from one of the places mazes keep popping up: gardens. Some of the world's most famous gardens house mazes, like the 18,000 square foot hedge maze outside Schönbrunn Palace, the Labyrinth Park of Horta in Barcelona, the Labyrinth at Villa Pisani where Napoleon is said to have gotten lost for an hour. These garden mazes all share two traits that seemingly have nothing in common. First, a meticulously manicured standard of beauty. Second, a game that you might find in a kid's activity booklet. But these shared traits suggest a relationship, a connection, between the beauty of the space and the function of the maze to keep garden visitors from seeing that beauty all in one glance. By setting up obstacles to our procession through a garden, mazes prompt us to slow down and appreciate our surroundings. Where we see the open garden lawn and pass on by with a satisfied look, a maze on the lawn draws us in with, surprisingly, walls. Mazes celebrate space in the same way that challenge celebrates desire, by obstructing it. In the story collection 1001 Nights, Scheherazade stops the king's 3-year murder spree by ensnaring him with stories. She marries him, and each night tells a long story but stops with a cliffhanger at dawn. The king is desperate for the ending, and so decides to keep her alive until the next night, where he might hear the story completed. This goes on for 1001 nights until his massacre is eventually ended. Scheherazade saves the day, not by immediately gratifying the king, but by expertly delaying that gratification with the twisting paths of plot. Since the king models readers' experiences of the stories in 1001 Nights that follow his own, this framing story reveals obstacle as the elemental attraction of narrative. Stories have the power to engender desire in the heart of the listener, and then, paradoxically, for and against that desire, make the listener wait as long as possible to hear the story completed, to create a wish in the heart of the reader, and then establish obstacles such that that wish might ripen and intensify. There is not a medium more suited for this experience of deferral and desire than games, because games are made of rules. Seen one way, games are nothing but the aforementioned obstacles. What else is a golf course? Or the suspects, rooms, and murder weapons of Clue? Or the gap between Mario and his flag? These are objects of waiting and wanting, of not yet knowing or not yet having. Objects built to spark desire and therefore plots. Like a maze that compels us through space by setting up boundaries, games invite the motivations necessary for plot by setting up rules that obstruct those motivations. In terms of Freytag's model, which proposes that rising action is born of opposing protagonist and antagonist forces, game rules act as antagonists by impeding player freedoms and shaping motivation. In this way, games can charge any mundane activity with meaning and narrative intensity. To explain what I mean, consider how arcade machines make money. Let's take the classic claw game as an example. Now, the claw crane takes what is arguably the simplest human act, picking something up, and antagonizes it by forcing users to use what is essentially a poorly designed machine. Most people playing the claw crane know that whatever prize they're after isn't worth the money they're paying to play. So why do it? Well, the claw machine actually does something pretty amazing. It electrifies that everyday action of picking something up with plot. I mentioned that it's poorly designed, and that's not really true. In fact, it's carefully designed to antagonize players just enough. The dimensions of the mechanical hand, the prizes, and the feel of the controls are chosen for one reason. They make for great drama. The same could be said for the size of the cornhole board, the height of a basketball hoop, or the running speed in Fortnite. These are not arbitrary mechanical choices. They're storytelling choices. It's no accident, of course, that a prize will slip through the claw's grasp at the very last moment. Money-grabbing arcade and carnival games are fine-tuned to create precisely the same psychological experience of Scheherazade's 1001 Tales. In a game, the desires induced by acting within that game's rule set create plots that, just like any other story, motivate us to see them through to their end. This is what I mean when I say that games celebrate desire. Understood that way, studying storycraft becomes indistinguishable from studying game design, which almost always concerns itself with retaining player attention, with designing irresistible objects that catalyze player motivations into plots. Elden Ring opens, like many AAA titles, with a short cinematic explanation of the game's world. Like Hidetaka Miyazaki's earlier work, it's as obtuse as it is interesting. The world has suffered an apocalyptic war. Bizarre, monstrous characters flash across the screen with inscrutable one-line descriptions like the ever-brilliant gold mask. Your own character is described enigmatically as a tarnished of no renown. You emerge from the tutorial into an enormous landscape with a hint at where to go and a rough understanding of how to deal with threats. Almost immediately, the opening cinematic is forgotten for the tasks of looking around and staying alive. The cutscene story is unnecessary for motivating players into an experience with so many other motivations on offer. Maybe a landmark on the horizon sparks your curiosity. Maybe an enemy soldier patrolling the path prompts you to test your mettle. There are fruits in a nearby bush that might prove helpful if you collected them. A character seems ready to talk. Are they a friend or a foe? A golden line reminds you of the larger task announced in the opening cinematic, something about becoming the Elden Lord. And a motivation possibly more elusive than these others is the deliberation between these options. With the first step in any of these directions, Elden Ring begins to author a plot. However long or short, fulfilling or pointless. Some of these plots fit cleanly within our understanding of conventional story. Some of them are something else entirely, written by the unique affordances of games. Some plots will ensnare us like a binge-worthy Netflix show or gripping novel until the early hours of the morning. Most of them will lead to ever more stories. Many of them will be over in a matter of moments, but all of them exist in the dense multi-plot web that Elden Ring weaves. As we widen our definition of plot to include things like scavenging for food or searching the environment, it becomes apparent that games, in fact, often tell more stories, are more narrative than other storytelling forms. These arcs compound in effect as they stack. As one motivation is underway, the others are still in mind, compelling us forward. Victorian multi-plot novels like Middlemarch or Bleak House, or contemporary television like Downton Abbey or Westworld employ any number of threads that hope to capture audiences, and often eventually braid together in a climactic moment. But where Westworld's writers can only hope that the thread on screen at a given moment is worthy of stealing attention away from any of the others, games can offer every thread at every moment. Again, many of the plots in this compelling weave of story threads don't even come from conventional storytelling tools like characters or cutscenes, or even from side quests and board game themes. Like the drama authored by a claw machine, many of these plots use methods we're least likely to identify as storytelling devices at all. Here's The Ambassadors, a commission by late Renaissance painter Hans Holbein. A clergyman and an ambassador flank a table loaded with objects. Most reads of the painting focus on the symbolic nature of these instruments and the social stations the men hold. The painting begins to tell a story about the conflict between religious, political, and scientific power. But a diagonal slash of ivory imposes itself in the foreground. As it turns out, this slash is actually a famous example of what would eventually be called anamorphism, where something, in this case a human skull, is painted from an oblique perspective. To see the skull, the viewer is forced to stand off to the side. Here, a hidden memento mori subverts the other symbolic objects. As is the case with any anamorphic image, the interaction of the viewer is implicated by demanding the viewer shift perspective in order to see the skull. This, of course, delays and complicates comprehension of the painting. With the delay, a plot is born, where viewers move from disorientation to recognition to eventual clarity. With the anamorphic skull, Holbein authored something more than the symbolic system at play here. Like a game designer, he authored an interaction as much as he authored an image. Viewers need to work to understand the image, and as a result, the story of that work becomes a part of the image's meaning. These narratives work at a remove from their creators, and we have to revise our conventional notions of authorship if we're to understand them as narratives at all. Game designers often don't create stories directly. Game designers create games that in turn produce stories. Elden Ring may produce a story where a player scrapes through a difficult encounter after being ambushed on a rainy cliffside trail. Miyazaki and the team at From Software didn't author this bespoke experience, they did something more. They built a machine that would inevitably craft these sorts of narratives on the fly, as the game was operated. Consider, for example, the Japanese kids show Pythagoras Switch.
Mini.
On Pythagoras Switch, Rube Goldberg machines are presented as plots. What you're watching now is from a segment called Bisuki's Ball Adventure.
ビー玉ビーすけの大冒険
Voiceover narrates a story of a red ball as it frees two other balls and they escape from the captivity of the larger black balls. Critically, though, the voiceover is unnecessary. All plot can be inferred from the physics machine. Everything necessary for a story is here. There are twists of fate, collisions and conflict, relief in the final denouement. The showrunners at Pythagoras Switch built a machine that would tell a story once it was animated and operated instead of animating and narrating that story themselves. Where games have rules, the ball adventure has physics, like gravity and inertia. But like a game, the stories authored in Bisuki's Ball Adventure are authored by the machine, and the machine is designed by those with an eye for what mechanical interactions might produce compelling plots. Clearly, the outcome is much more determined than something like Elden Ring, with carefully prepared paths instead of open fields, but the distanced relationship between author and story is the same. Mousetrap even includes the construction of a Rube Goldberg machine as one of its plots. As players lap around the board, they add pieces to the device and tension mounts as it nears completion. As soon as the machine is complete and players start the marble rolling, another plot is afoot. Sometimes the machine is imperfect and the marble stops short or falls off track, an outcome authored by the nature of the machine, drafted by the designers and built by the players. Not only are multiple outcomes possible, but multiple stories can run in parallel during the course of play. While players are imploded and gathering more cheese than their opponents, the plot of the trap construction is underway. We know good games are compelling for a multitude of reasons. Reasons including but never limited to conventional narrative attractions like character, setting, or theme. As was evident in Monopoly or the opening animation of Elden Ring, games can tell stories with the same affordances of cinema, drama, or literature, but often more than tell a story, they produce one, as an effect of their particular machine-like interactive qualities. As we saw with mazes, any finely tuned obstacle will provoke motivation. Each of these motivations, conventional or otherwise, might be named as a type of plot, each with its own narrative arc, one for the cutscenes or a character, yes, but one too for an upgrade we've yet to get, or a level we've yet to beat, or a puzzle that resists our efforts to solve it. Now, we may have some sense that these compulsions aren't plots at all, that if a game tells a story, it's only by means available to other storytelling media, and that there are simply parts of a game that aren't the storytelling parts. Nonsense. If plot is indeed a function of desire, and desire is spurred on by obstacles, then games, predicated on meaningful obstacles, can't ever be non-narrative. They are, in fact, story machines, just as potent with plot as any existing art form, producing tales of all kinds at every turn. This must be, at least in major part, why we keep playing them. In the 3 videos that follow this one, Games and Culture will be exploring the kinds of stories that games write, how they radically revise those forms, and how animating player motivation takes human storytelling into entirely new territory. Thanks for watching. For this essay, I'm going to try something a little bit different. In my previous videos, I've done some academic citation and sources as I've gone through my argument, but this time I decided to lump all of that here at the end in this section so that if you don't care too much about the academic discussion part of this whole thing, you can just stop watching. But if you are interested in some of the more bookish academic stuff, that's what I'll be going over now. I'm going to be talking about things that directly influence my thought and my argument here, but also trying to paint sort of a bigger picture of where the academic discussion is in regards to games and storytelling. So I want to start off by talking about Salin and Zimmerman's rules of play. This is kind of the quintessential textbook for game design and game studies. This has a whole chapter on game narrative in it, and that narrative chapter talks explicitly about how mechanics can create narratives themselves, something you hear me talk about in the essay. And I think the discussion of mechanics and narrative is really good. I don't so much like how narrative is sort of cordoned off as its own chapter here instead of underpinning everything the book has to say about meaning. Obviously, if you're paying attention to my essay, that's how I think this works. I think if a game is going to be meaningful, it's going to be meaningful by narrative means. To sum up my position and sort of how I feel about a lot of the voices in conversation, I'm going to respond to a quote from a really great book called Avatars of Story by Marie-Laura Ryan. Let me read this quote from her. She says, "The main reason for using narrative concepts in game studies is to come to terms with the imaginative dimension of computer games, a dimension that will be overlooked if we concentrate exclusively on rules, problem solving, and competition." I really love what she's saying here about the imaginative dimension of games. Of course, that's where their meaning and their human impact is going to come from. But where I disagree is where she adds that this dimension, the imaginative dimension, will be overlooked if we start focusing on rules, problem solving, and competition. No, in fact, I think it's looking at those rules and the means of competition that will lead us right back to the imaginative dimension, that will lead us back to narrative concepts. I also want to mention Ian Bogost's persuasive games. In particular, a term he uses called procedural rhetoric. What procedural rhetoric is essentially a name for communication that happens as a byproduct of a process. If you're paying attention to my essay at all, you know that that's pretty essential to what I'm trying to say. I want to mention Espen Aarseth's cybertext, but before I get into it, I need to contextualize a debate that's been going on for 25 years in game studies between narratologists who study media through traditional conventional terms of narrative study, terms that have been around for 100 years, and then the ludologists. Aarseth is a ludologist, and what they believe is essentially narrative theory, the narratologists, by applying conventional literary theory and critique to games, are disfiguring what games are actually capable of and what they do best. As an example of what I mean, let me read a quote here from the end of Cybertext, where Aarseth is describing this narrative theory and the influence thereof as a dystopia. "This dystopia is, of course, the omnipresent influence of narrative, both as a hegemonic theory of discourse and as a socially dominating aesthetic mode." Aarseth is characterizing literary theory as this corrupting force that colonializes game studies and starts to distort our view of what a game is or what it can do. I disagree. I don't think that narrative theory is this top-down force that sort of insists on a model that everything then has to sort of slide into and fit. Instead, I think narrative theory at its best is investigating what bubbles up from the bottom, that if we look closely at games and how competition and rules work, we'll see that we're compelled by these things because narrative is an inevitable part of how we act and how we perceive the world as human beings. This is owed at least a little bit to Walter Fisher's work on narrative paradigms. I don't have that on the table here with me, but be sure to investigate that if you're at all interested. That's a good jumping off point for me to talk about two individual essays that were very influential on my thought here. The first is from Henry Jenkins, Game Design as Narrative Architecture. Jenkins introduces this term micronarrative that, once you understand, I think you'll see its influence on my essay here. He writes, "Narrative can also enter games on the level of localized incident, or what I'm calling micronarratives." Later on in that paragraph, he writes, "Micronarratives may be cutscenes, but they don't have to be. One can imagine a simple sequence of pre-programmed actions through which an opposing player responds to your successful touchdown in a football game as a micronarrative." In my essay, where I'm stacking all these Freytag graphs on top of each other and talking about the small moments of a game that are also packed with narrative potential, this is really where I'm getting this idea from. Now, also borrowing this idea of micronarratives without actually calling them micronarratives is the essay Tools for Creating Dramatic Game Dynamics by Marc LeBlanc. LeBlanc's essay is also full of Freytag pyramids, I think because, like I say in part one of my essay, he's interested in charting these hidden dynamics that we don't immediately see in game design. In particular, I want to focus on this description he has of a turn in the card game Magic the Gathering. He talks about how as a turn goes on, you feel this dramatic tension start to increase. And then finally, he ends this way. "Either way, the game reaches its conclusion quickly. We can see how the dramatic tension of the game is regulated by the game dynamics, the escalation of resources, and the ticking clock of the deck. These mechanisms sculpt the tension of the game into a proper dramatic arc." almost exactly what I'm trying to say in my essay. One of the most influential, if not the most influential thing that I read in preparation for this essay was the 1984 book by Peter Brooks, Reading for the Plot. What Brooks is trying to do here is essentially a marriage between psychoanalysis and literary theory. He's looking for an answer to why we feel seduced into a given work and why we feel so compelled to see it through to its end. This book is about a lot of things, but I think one of my main takeaways is about the relationship between meaning and time. Essentially, Brooks is saying that stories are our attempt to gather meaning from the chaos of everyday life. For example, he says, narrative indeed has to do with the recovery of the past, and more generally with the attempted rescue of meaning from passing time. Later on, right before the end of the book, he sums up his thoughts as this: narrative is one of the ways in which we speak, one of the large categories in which we think. Plot is its thread of design and its active shaping force, the product of our refusal to allow temporality to be meaningless, our stubborn insistence on making meaning in the world and in our lives. I think this is what rules do with everyday life as well. I think rules capture all the plot energy of life and gather them into these memorable moments. The core motivation for this video, and really this longer investigation into game narrative, really comes from a dissatisfaction that I've started to feel with the level of analysis capable or possible for those in game studies looking at game stories. As a footnote, let me mention briefly Clint Hawking's now infamous term ludonarrative dissonance from his essay/review of BioShock. In the review, Hawking describes a conflict between two separate meanings. He suggests that the ludo part of the game, the gameplay, means something other than what the narrative or storytelling part of the game means. Thus we have ludo, gameplay, narrative, story, dissonance. They have two separate meanings. My issue with this, and the dissatisfaction I have with so much writing about game analysis, is that if the ludo part of the game, the gameplay, mechanical part of the game means something, how? How does it mean something? Of course, my answer, if you're paying attention to the essay, is that it also tells a story. The only revision I would make to Hawking's point is that there's no such thing as ludo-narrative dissonance. It's always narrative dissonance. That the ludo part of the game, the gameplay part of the game, is only meaningful if it also tells a story. Now, it's through different means. Sure, BioShock has different means of telling a story, and I think those things probably are in conflict. I think Hawking is right. But I think Hawking's notion that the ludic part of the game is meaningful without being narrative is really misleading. I think the only way that the ludic part of the game, the mechanical gameplay part, could be meaningful is if it is also telling a story, albeit a different one. The only answer for that kind of dissatisfaction that I found comes from Jenkins and LeBlanc and this idea that narratives are happening on a small level. To use Jenkins' actual language, what he calls the localized incident. I mentioned that there are 3 videos after this one, and in those 3 videos, our scope will get successively smaller. We're going to zoom in to see how these narratives are at play in everything from, yes, character sympathy and the traditional means of narrative, but even something as mechanical and seemingly non-narrative as a button press. Again, thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around all the way to the end here. If you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon. You can subscribe to Games and Culture here on YouTube. You can hit that like button, or better yet, you can share this video with someone who you think might find this stuff compelling or interesting.